The medieval world Columbus inherited. Christopher Columbus was born into a world undergoing profound transformation. The 18th century marked the twilight of the medieval period and the dawn of the Renaissance, a time when traditional certainties were being challenged by new ideas, technologies, and possibilities. To understand Columbus' place in history, we must first examine the complex world that shaped his ambitions and made his voyages both possible and necessary. The Europe of Columbus' youth was a patchwork of competing kingdoms, city-states, and emerging nation-states. The Holy Roman Empire, though still nominally powerful, was fragmenting. France and England were locked in the final stages of the Hundred Years' War. The Ottoman Empire was expanding into Europe, having conquered Constantinople in 1815, just 2 years after Columbus' birth. This expansion created both fear and opportunity, as traditional trade routes to the east were increasingly controlled by Muslim powers. The Italian peninsula, Columbus' birthplace, was the epicenter of Renaissance humanism and commercial innovation. The Greek maritime republics of Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and Amalfi had for centuries dominated Mediterranean trade, accumulating vast wealth and developing sophisticated banking and navigation techniques. Genoa, Columbus' birthplace, was particularly renowned for its navigators and explorers, including the Vivaldi brothers who had attempted to reach India by sailing west around Africa in Ek, disappearing in the process but leaving behind a legacy of daring that would inspire future generations. The Portuguese maritime revolution. Portugal, under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, had pioneered systematic oceanic exploration. Beginning in the early 18th century, Portuguese expeditions systematically explored the African coast, establishing trading posts and gradually working their way toward the southern tip of the continent. This methodical approach was driven by multiple motivations: the search for gold and slaves, the desire to outflank Muslim control of eastern trade routes, and the Christian mission to find the legendary kingdom of Prester John, believed to be a Christian ruler in Africa or Asia. By Columbus' time, Portuguese navigators had developed revolutionary new technologies and techniques. The caravel, a light and maneuverable sailing ship, could sail closer to the wind than previous vessels. The astrolabe and quadrant allowed for more precise celestial navigation. Most importantly, the Portuguese had accumulated detailed knowledge of Atlantic wind patterns, ocean currents, and navigation techniques that made long-distance oceanic voyages feasible. The Portuguese success in African exploration was both an inspiration and a challenge to other European powers. Spain, newly unified under the Catholic monarchs Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, was eager to find its own route to the riches of Asia. The papal bulls of Ek-Jar and Ek-Jar had granted Portugal exclusive rights to African exploration, making an alternative route essential for Spanish ambitions. The intellectual revolution, geography and cosmology. Columbus' proposal for a westward route to Asia was rooted in the intellectual ferment of Renaissance geography and cosmology. The rediscovery of classical texts, particularly Ptolemy's geography, had revolutionized European understanding of the world's shape and size. However, these ancient texts contained significant errors that would prove crucial to Columbus' calculations. Ptolemy had underestimated the Earth's circumference by about 2 pach, calculating it at roughly ek at 0.00 miles rather than the actual 2.9 ek miles. Additionally, his maps showed Asia extending much further east than it actually does, and the existence of the Pacific Ocean was unknown to Europeans. These errors, when combined with more recent works like Pierre Daly's Qui Imago Mundi and Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli's correspondence, led Columbus to believe that the Atlantic Ocean was relatively narrow and that Asia could be reached by sailing west in a matter of weeks. The intellectual climate of the 18th century was also marked by increasing interest in empirical observation and practical experimentation. Humanist scholars were beginning to question ancient authorities and seek new sources of knowledge. This spirit of inquiry, combined with the practical needs of merchants and rulers, created an environment in which Columbus' seemingly impossible proposal could be taken seriously. The Spanish context, Reconquista and national unification. Columbus arrived in Spain at a pivotal moment in that nation's history. The marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon in Ek-Jar had united the two largest Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, creating the foundation for modern Spain. However, this unity was still fragile and required constant reinforcement through military success, territorial expansion, and the creation of a unified religious and cultural identity. The Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to recapture the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, was nearing its conclusion. Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, was under constant pressure and would finally fall in Ekjar Naidui, the same year Columbus embarked on his first voyage. This timing was not coincidental. The completion of the Reconquista freed Spanish resources and attention for new ventures while creating a sense of divinely ordained mission that would characterize Spanish colonialism. The Spanish monarchy's support for Columbus must be understood within this context of religious crusade and territorial expansion. The Catholic monarchs saw themselves as champions of Christianity, destined to spread the faith to new lands and peoples. Columbus promised to reach the Indies and convert its inhabitants to Christianity, aligned perfectly with this religious mission while offering the prospect of vast new wealth to fund further expansion. The economic context, trade routes and precious metals. The European economy of the 18th century was increasingly dependent on long-distance trade, particularly the lucrative spice trade with Asia. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and other spices were not merely luxuries but necessities for food preservation and medical treatment. The traditional routes to Asia passed through the eastern Mediterranean, controlled by Venice and ultimately by the Ottoman Empire, making spices extremely expensive in Western Europe. The Portuguese attempts to reach Asia by sailing around Africa represented one solution to this problem, but progress was slow and uncertain. Columbus' proposal offered the tantalizing possibility of a shorter, more direct route that would give Spain a decisive advantage in the Asian trade. The potential profits were enormous. Successful control of a western route to Asia could make Spain the wealthiest nation in Europe. The European monetary system of the period was also undergoing significant changes. The growth of banking and credit mechanisms, pioneered by Italian merchants, was creating new possibilities for financing large-scale ventures. However, the European economy suffered from a chronic shortage of precious metals, particularly gold and silver, which were essential for international trade. Columbus' promise to discover new sources of gold was therefore particularly attractive to his potential sponsors. Columbus' place in the age of exploration. Columbus was both a product of his time and a catalyst for its transformation. His background as a Genoese merchant mariner gave him practical knowledge of navigation and seamanship, while his residence in Portugal exposed him to the cutting-edge techniques of oceanic exploration. His largely self-taught education in geography and cosmology reflected the Renaissance ideal of the learned gentleman, while his religious conviction aligned with the crusading spirit of the age. However, Columbus also embodied the contradictions and limitations of his era. His understanding of geography, while sophisticated by contemporary standards, was fundamentally flawed. His treatment of indigenous peoples reflected medieval European assumptions about cultural and religious superiority. His administrative failures as a colonial governor demonstrated the gap between the skills needed for exploration and those required for governance. The historical significance of Columbus lies not in his personal qualities, which were decidedly mixed, but in the timing and consequences of his voyages. He arrived at the precise moment when European technology, knowledge, and ambition had developed to the point where transoceanic exploration was feasible, while European political and economic pressures made such exploration necessary. His voyages opened a new chapter in world history, initiating the first truly global age and setting in motion changes that continue to shape our world today. The immediate historical impact. Columbus' first voyage in Ekjar Naidui immediately transformed European understanding of the world's geography and possibilities. The news of his discovery spread rapidly throughout Europe, inspiring a wave of exploration and colonization that would continue for centuries. Spanish expeditions followed quickly, with Alonso de Ojeda, Vicente Yespinin, and others exploring the South American coast within a decade of Columbus' first voyage. The papal bulls of Ekjar Naidui, particularly Intercatera, attempted to divide the newly discovered lands between Spain and Portugal, establishing the principle of European sovereignty over non-Christian territories. The Treaty of Tordesillas in Ekjar Naidui refined this division, giving Portugal rights to Brazil while confirming Spanish claims to most of the Americas. These legal frameworks reflected European assumptions about their right to claim and colonize lands inhabited by non-Christian peoples. The immediate economic impact was also significant, though not in the ways Columbus had anticipated. Rather than reaching the spice markets of Asia, his voyages opened access to new sources of gold, silver, and other valuable commodities. The Spanish quickly established mining operations in the Caribbean and later on the American mainland, generating enormous wealth that would transform the European economy. Long-term historical consequences. The long-term historical consequences of Columbus' voyages were far more profound than anyone could have imagined in Ek Char Nai Dui. The connection between the Old and New Worlds initiated what historian Alfred Crosby termed the Columbian Exchange, a massive transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and peoples that reshaped societies on both sides of the Atlantic. European diseases, to which Native American populations had no immunity, caused demographic catastrophes of unprecedented scale. Estimates suggest that the indigenous population of the Americas declined by 9% or more in the century following first contact, primarily due to epidemic diseases like smallpox, measles, and typhus. This demographic collapse facilitated European colonization and fundamentally altered the development of American societies. Simultaneously, American crops like potatoes, tomatoes, corn, and tobacco revolutionized European agriculture and diet, supporting population growth and economic development. The massive influx of American silver, particularly from the mines of Potos in present-day Bolivia, created the world's first global currency and enabled the expansion of international trade on an unprecedented scale. The establishment of European colonies in the Americas also led to the forced migration of millions of Africans through the Atlantic slave trade. This tragic development created new societies and cultures throughout the Americas while devastating African communities and establishing patterns of racial oppression that would persist for centuries. Columbus in historical memory. The historical reputation of Columbus has undergone significant changes over the centuries. In the immediate aftermath of his voyages, he was often overshadowed by more successful conquistadors like Herne Cortes and Francisco Pizarro, who conquered wealthy indigenous empires and delivered vast treasures to Spain. Columbus' failure to find the riches of Asia and his administrative problems as a colonial governor initially limited his historical reputation. During the Age of Enlightenment, writers like Voltaire began to celebrate Columbus as a representative of human reason and scientific progress, triumphing over medieval superstition and ignorance. This interpretation, while historically inaccurate in many respects, established Columbus as a symbol of European intellectual and technological superiority. The 9th century saw the creation of the heroic Columbus mythology that dominated popular understanding for over a century. Writers like Washington Irving romanticized Columbus' story, creating the fictional narrative of the explorer who proved the earth was round against the opposition of ignorant medieval authorities. This mythology served various political purposes, particularly in the United States, where Columbus became a symbol of the nation's European heritage and its destiny to expand across the continent. The approach of the 50th anniversary of Columbus' first voyage in Ek Nai Dui prompted a major reassessment of his historical significance. Indigenous rights activists and their supporters challenged the traditional celebration of Columbus, emphasizing the devastating impact of European colonization on Native American peoples. This counter-key perspective highlighted the agency and sophistication of indigenous societies while acknowledging the tragic consequences of European contact. Contemporary historical scholarship has sought to understand Columbus within his proper historical context, neither demonizing nor romanticizing his role. Modern historians recognize Columbus as a skilled navigator and determined explorer whose voyages had world historical significance, while also acknowledging his limitations as an administrator and his participation in the oppression of indigenous peoples. This balanced approach seeks to understand Columbus as a complex historical figure whose actions must be evaluated within the context of his time while recognizing their lasting consequences for all humanity.